Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for making my last performance the best.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for helping me have one last performance with the people I love.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for my first run ever.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for allowing me to have this incredible experience.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for helping me make a lot of new friends.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting me have the best 18th birthday ever.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting me raise up my book for the last time.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting me have a great show.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting my senior year go out with a bang. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for helping me catch my rifle at Chart 23. Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting me have the greatest show of my life.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for making my freshman year memorable.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting me hold out the high G at Chart 27.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for the amazing memories I made this weekend.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for the awesome feature.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for making me hit Chart 30.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting me play the 16th notes in the Trumpet Mellow feature.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for letting me play the 16th notes in Chart 14.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for allowing the band to create wonderful memories this year.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for giving me the most memorable year of my life.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for the great memories we had this year.
Thank you so much, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for allowing us to bring out the emotion of the show.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for awesome times.
Thank you, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, for an incredible weekend.
Thank you, Mr. and Mr. Thompson, for helping me play those low notes on my tuba.